Imagine a young woman, trembling yet defiant, standing before the bench of an elderly judge whose calm eyes have seen decades of human imperfection. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old leather, a steady tick of the wall clock punctuating the otherwise hushed murmurs. Around her, the rows of worn benches held a scattering of onlookers, neighbors, some reporters, a bailiff quietly standing near the door. Her hands clutched a folded sheet of paper, knuckles white, voice steady despite the tight line of her jaw. Behind her, a man sat with arms folded so firmly across his chest it was as if the very muscles might crack. His tailored suit caught the harsh overhead light, his expression unreadable, but the rigid set of his shoulders told more. An iron will, a promise that consequence could be purchased or denied. His eyes rarely left his daughter, narrow and calculating, the air around him thick with unspoken power. "I am aware of my rights, Your Honor," the young woman began, voice edged with both determination and a hint of desperation. According to Section 1246B, a citation must be dismissed if the signage is unclear, which in this case it was. Judge Caprio's gaze did not waver. His hands rested calmly on the bench, a slight crease between his brows, eyes reflecting not impatience, but a deep, patient inquiry. There was no scorn in his silence, only the kind of attention that invited truth to reveal itself, however awkward or fragile. The courtroom's ambient noises, the scrape of chair legs, soft coughs, began to fade as everyone leaned in. The woman's words came with precision, delivered as if molded by countless rehearsals. She quoted statute numbers, regulatory codes from memory, a recital of legalese meant to bolster her defense. Yet, beneath those polished phrases, Judge Caprio detected a tremor, not in her voice, but in the urgency behind the polish, a nervousness that spoke more of fear than conviction. Her father's thin smile tightened imperceptibly. He believed knowledge was power, that knowing the law, even better, weaponizing it, would insulate them both. But the judge's eyes caught the subtle misstep. One citation was incorrect, a small but critical flaw in the legal armor. The judge leaned forward slightly, the faint creak of leather from his chair breaking the pause. He did not interrupt, letting her finish. Then, almost gently, he asked, "And who taught you these words?" The question hung in the air, elegantly simple but sharp in consequence. The young woman's eyes flickered downward, a shadow crossing her face, before she looked back up and said softly, "My father's lawyer." A ripple murmured through the courtroom like a sudden breeze passing through rustling leaves. The man's face froze. His eyes betrayed a flicker of something darker than anger. The past decades of influence and power stood suddenly fragile under that quiet admission. The room felt tighter, the walls closing in not around the law, but around loyalty, and the unspoken cost of reputation placed above honesty. The judge's expression remained unreadable. Beneath his calm, something was settling. This was no longer about a parking ticket. It was about truth itself, fragile and relentless. He adjusted his glasses, folded his hands, and waited silently for what would come next. The weight of that moment lingered, quiet, suspended, a prelude to the reckoning that justice, in its gentlest form, demanded. Judge Caprio's voice was gentle as he leaned forward, eyes steady on the young woman. "Can you tell me what this law says, exactly?" Her fingers gripped the edges of the folded statute, voice steadier than her trembling hands. "It says, well, it protects me from being fined for parking if I have a valid disability placard." She glanced up, eyes scanning the courtroom, as though daring anyone to challenge her. "Section 14(1) says the permit holder can park in designated areas without penalty. "Read it aloud for us," the judge invited softly. She inhaled sharply, the paper rustling as her voice wavered from confident to uncertain halfway through. Words stumbled out, the cadence breaking unevenly. The courtroom fell into a hush so complete that the tick of a clock sounded sharp in the silence. Caprio's gaze softened, but carried unmistakable weight as he interrupted. "You see, that line there, valid only when the placard is displayed, often gets missed. You didn't mention it." Her eyes flicked to the statute, searching the page hurriedly. I thought it said that if you have the placard, the rules don't apply." The judge's voice lowered, but remained precise. "No, it's critical. You must display the placard. Without it showing, the protection doesn't activate. That small omission changes the entire meaning." Behind her, a low murmur escaped as her father shifted, voice gruff and involuntary. "She's young, Your Honor." Judge Caprio's gaze lifted to meet the father's, then returned to the young woman. "Young, yes, but responsible for what you say and for how well you understand it. Do you feel responsible for your own words?" Her breath caught. Eyes darted toward the floor, then back up, frantic, searching for a foothold. Her jaw tightened. The tension in her slender hands increased. Finally, a whisper, barely audible. I didn't actually read the code myself." A pause, heavy enough to fold into the walls. "I only repeated what I was told," she admitted, voice slipping into a fragile confession. Judge Caprio's face held no condemnation, only a steady kindness that felt more demanding than anger. A silence pregnant with quiet disappointment, like a teacher watching a student on the edge of a hard truth. Far behind her, her father's jaw clenched, his lips pressed into a thin line, shadows momentarily darkening his usually composed features. That silence stretched, a fragile thread tightening between the facts and the feelings beneath. Eyes in the courtroom shifted, the whispers subsiding again, but something heavier settled. An unspoken reckoning, a quiet shattering of illusions. The judge's glance lingered on her, steady and even, as if inviting more than words, inviting understanding. In that still space, beneath the bright courtroom light, a rehearsal ended, and the real truth began. After a pause, Judge Caprio cleared his throat and rested his gaze gently on the man, the father, seated behind the young woman. "Mr. Harper," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "would you please come forward?" The man rose without a word, his polished shoes echoing sharply on the courtroom's hardwood floor. Each step carried a weight of authority, and something else, an unspoken tension. Judge Caprio watched him approach, the courtroom air thickening. The man's posture was straight, his face carefully composed, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed a flicker of unease. Standing now, just a few feet from the bench, the father took a breath that seemed to steady more than it freed him. "Your Honor," he began, tone crisp and measured, "this entire citation is absurd. My daughter should never have been dragged into this. It's a waste of time and resources. That ticket was issued over a trivial matter that's being blown out of proportion." The judge nodded slowly, giving him leave to speak fully, the lines on his face deepening with quiet attentiveness. The courtroom held its breath, the low murmur of shifting bodies and rustling papers the only sound during the silence following the man's words. When the father finished, Caprio's eyes met his with calm scrutiny. The soft weight of years lived in truth in every glance. Then, after a pause that invited reflection rather than confrontation, the judge leaned in slightly and asked, "Did you tell her what to say today?" The question hung in the air, calm but direct. The father's eyes flickered briefly, just enough to reveal a flash of something defensive beneath his composed exterior. His mouth pressed into a thin line before he answered too quickly, too sharply. "No, Your Honor, I did not." For a moment, the judge said nothing. His gaze shifted from the man to the daughter seated beside him. Where moments ago there had been a veneer of composure, something fragile now emerged. Her lips trembled, and moisture welled in her eyes, threatening to spill. The silence stretched, thick and palpable, until the daughter's voice came, barely audible at first, then gathering strength. "He told me to say whatever worked." A collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom, sharp, shocked, disbelieving. The daughter's admission cut through the room like winter light, cold and clear. The father's face flushed a deep red. His hand shot up, voice tight with outrage. "I demand those words be stricken from the record." Before the judge could respond, his gavel descended with a steady, singular bang, a call for order that stilled both voice and air. "No, Mr. Harper," Judge Caprio said quietly. "Those words stand." The room fell utterly silent again. The father, now seated, stared ahead, expression clenched and raw. Somewhere behind the bitterness, a crack appeared, something human and unguarded. The daughter looked down, the weight of betrayal and a sudden, trembling freedom settling into her bones. She was no longer just a shield or a mouthpiece. In that silence, the first step had been taken, toward truth, however painful or uncertain it might be. Judge Caprio's voice softened, taking on a weight that filled the quiet courtroom without demanding it. "Tell me," he said gently, "what are you studying? What do you hope to become?" For a moment, she looked down, fingers twisting the edge of a paper, a tremor passing through her. Then, as if the words pushed through a dam, she whispered, "A lawyer." The room seemed to hold its breath. The father's gaze slipped away from the bench, dropping to his clenched hands folded tightly in his lap. Caprio nodded slowly, not as one passing judgment, but almost as if acknowledging an unspoken truth. "Then," he said quietly, "this might be your first real case." The statement hovered between them, shifting the atmosphere from accusation to something less hostile, more intimate. The young woman's eyes flickered up, uncertainty and resolve mingling there. The courtroom settled into a stillness measured in heartbeats. "Explain to me, in your own words," the judge continued, "what responsibility means to you." Her throat tightened. She swallowed, searching the cavernous space inside her for an answer. The words didn't come easily, not rehearsed lines, but something harder and rawer. "Responsibility," she began, voice fragile. It's being truthful, even when it's hard. Even when what you say might disappoint someone you care about. It's not just knowing the rules or quoting the law." Her eyes shimmered, the edges wet with unshed tears. "It's about owning up to things, even when you're scared." The judge watched her quietly, not pushing, just letting the moment grow. Around them, the courtroom breathed with suspended anticipation. She cleared her throat. "I thought if I sounded certain, if I spoke like I knew the law, that would protect me. Or maybe protect my father. But I wasn't honest, with myself or with you." She paused, voice breaking slightly. "I was pretending. Not just about the law, but about who I am supposed to be. I wanted to impress you, the judge, and him." Her glance flicked to her father. The man's face tightened, the pride and defiance fading, replaced by something less visible but heavy. Silence stretched, thick and reverent. The judge leaned back, hands folded calmly on the bench. His expression was unreadable but steady, a calm harbor in the storm of emotion. The daughter's words landed quietly, reverberating in the stillness. It was a confession made not under pressure, but born from a sudden clarity, one that often comes late, but is no less profound. The father didn't speak. His eyes traced the floor as if mapping old regrets. He had pushed his influence, his expectations, unknowingly cornering the girl into a role that had cracked her confidence. His pride, once a bulwark, now seemed a weight pulling her down. Caprio's gaze lingered on both of them, then shifted back to the young woman. "Thank you. That's more than many admit when faced with truth." His voice was gentle, but held the firmness of someone who understood the cost of honesty. In that charged silence, something unspoken passed between father and daughter. A fragile acknowledgement. Not triumph, not complete reconciliation, but the stirring of something new, self-awareness, and the first tentative step toward healing. The courtroom, previously tense with the weight of accusation and defense, felt transformed. What had begun as a dispute over a parking citation had become a glimpse into the complicated, tender reality of trust and expectation between parent and child. Judge Caprio's eyes softened, as if offering a small benediction. No fine would be imposed today. The real verdict was quieter, but far more profound. A young woman beginning to claim her own voice. A father given the chance to see beyond pride. And in that fragile moment, hope whispered quietly through the room, promising that change, however slow, was possible. A week had passed when she returned to the courtroom, this time without a summons, without the tension that had gripped all of them weeks before. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a neatly folded sheet of paper, the edges softened from frequent touch. The words she was about to read lined up like fragile soldiers. The courtroom felt different today. The harsh echoes had softened, replaced by a stillness marked not by silence, but something warmer, less brittle. Judge Caprio looked over his glasses as she approached the bench, his expression quiet, expectant, without pressure. The gallery was sparse. A few local journalists with cameras silently adjusted lenses, not eager for scandal, but witnessing the quiet unraveling of a family's truth. She cleared her throat, cheeks flushing, and began. "Your Honor, I am here today to acknowledge my mistakes." Her voice wavered, yet held a resolve that wasn't there before. "I misquoted the law. I spoke with certainty in a courtroom because I was afraid. Afraid not just of you or the consequences, but of disappointing my father." Her eyes flicked toward the back of the room. There, seated with a stiff posture, was her father. He didn't meet her gaze. Instead, his hands rested tightly folded in his lap, the polished shoes planted firmly on the marbled floor. The tension between them was palpable but, remarkably, unsaid. "My father," she continued, "has always been a force in our community. Powerful people surround him, and I was taught that admitting fault would be a weakness. I repeated what I was told, what I thought would protect us. But that fear led me to lie about what I knew, and I betrayed the very integrity I hoped to pursue as a lawyer." Her words were sincere, stripped of any attempt at justification or deflection. She looked down briefly, then raised her eyes, meeting the judge's steady gaze. Caprio nodded slowly, folding his hands atop the bench, a softening in his voice that carried no judgment, only quiet respect. "It takes a certain strength to return here without summons, and to speak truthfully not just about your actions, but about the influence behind them. This kind of courage isn't about punishment or exposure. It's about living honestly when no one is watching or applauding." He allowed his words to settle, the room absorbing the depth beyond mere legalities. The young woman's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if hearing something more profound than a verdict. From the back, the father shifted, unspoken conflict twisting his expression into a tighter shape. Then, almost imperceptibly, before the young woman could leave the stand, he leaned over and whispered, so soft it was nearly swallowed by the quiet room, "I'm proud of you." The warmth in that single sentence rose quietly, filling the space between them with something fragile but true, a first thread in mending a taut fabric stretched by power and fear. The judge watched this exchange, the corners of his mouth hinting at a faint smile, as if witnessing redemption not through legal justice, but something deeper. A father releasing, a daughter beginning anew. Outside, as cameras caught the final moments, there was no triumphant shout, no scandal to seize headlines. Instead, there was the fragile beauty of humility, the steady promise of accountability. The courtroom doors closed quietly behind her, leaving behind a space reshaped by honesty and the slow, enduring grace of truth. Months later, the corridor outside the courtroom felt quieter than usual, touched by the early morning light slipping through tall windows. Judge Caprio sat alone in his chambers, the familiar scent of old leather and polished wood wrapping around him like a comfortable shawl. On his desk lay a single envelope, cream-colored, edged with careful handwriting. He picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of the paper beneath his fingers. A letter from the daughter whose name had stirred so many currents just months before. He unfolded the note with a patience born of years spent reading stories, etched in words and silences. Her handwriting trembled slightly, yet the words were clear, grounded. She did not seek forgiveness for the misstep, nor did she ask for leniency. Her gratitude was quietly revolutionary in its essence. She thanked him for teaching her not how to avoid consequence, but how to live with what comes after. Outside, the muffled sounds of the city drifted in, a door creaking open, footsteps in a distant hallway, the faint murmur of life pressing on whisper soft. The judge's eyes traced each sentence again, the simple human truth nestled in every line. She spoke of accountability as a compass, a form of courage more daunting than any courtroom drama. It was a humility made active, a deliberate choice to own what had been broken without surrendering hope. He folded the letter back into its crease, smoothing the paper with the reverence of one handling something fragile yet unbreakable. Setting it beside his worn gavel, the wood darkened by decades of decisions, he leaned back and exhaled. A soft, full sigh that seemed to carry the gravity of all those who came before and all those who still would come. The judge's eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them again, they held a faint glimmer, a trace of a smile not for triumph, but for something quieter and far more profound. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "They usually quote the law to defend. She quoted it to learn." The silence settled then, not a void, but a presence, imposing, tender, carved from the small lives intersecting within these walls. No applause followed, no fanfare. Instead, a stillness wrapped the room like a verdict softly given, a recognition of grace earned through truth, the slow unfolding of respect, and the promise of a new path forged in humility and strength. Beyond the chambers, the city breathed onward, coursing through streets where stories long and short intertwined like shadows and light. Somewhere, a door opened again, and footsteps carried someone forward. Lighter now, unburdened, ready to face what comes next.